First of all, the birth sequence is completely astrological. The star in the east is Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which, on December 24th, aligns with the three brightest stars in Orion's belt. These three bright stars in Orion's belt are called today what they were called in ancient times, the Three Kings. And the Three Kings and the brightest star, Sirius, all point to the place of the sunrise on December 25th. This is why the Three Kings follow the star in the east, in order to locate the sunrise, the birth of the sun.
Once again, even if you were to label the three stars in Orion's belt the Three Kings, it would be irrelevant to the Bible, as is December 25th irrelevant. Though the Magi, not kings, presented three gifts, nowhere do the Bible writers make an issue of there being three of them in number. Apparently, it was insignificant to the Gospel writers, and so it is to us as well. This entire astrological premise is problematic. Not only does Sirius align with the three stars in Orion's belt 365 days a year, and not only in December, but they are more or less aligned to the sun for almost all of the winter months. There is nothing at all special about December 25th. In fact, it is by December 25th that Orion is almost totally below the horizon. It would be much more accurate of Zeitgeist if this event was said to happen a month or so earlier.
The Virgin Mary is the constellation Virgo, also known as Virgo the Virgin. Virgo in Latin means virgin. Virgo is also referred to as the house of bread, and the representation of Virgo is a virgin holding a sheaf of wheat. This house of bread and its symbol of wheat represents August and September, the time of harvest. In turn, Bethlehem in fact literally translates to house of bread. Bethlehem is thus a reference to the constellation Virgo, a place in the sky, not on earth.
Bethlehem indeed means house of bread. Nevertheless, there is no basis for concluding that Bethlehem was a fictitious place which was fabricated based upon the constellation Virgo in the sky. The existence of Bethlehem is attested by biblical and extra-biblical sources. First, Old Testament authors prior to the 1st century mention Bethlehem. Also, the Jewish historian Josephus mentions Bethlehem as the location where King David was anointed to be future king of Israel. J.B. Hennessy reports of the archaeological evidence demonstrating that Bethlehem was inhabited during the Iron Age in the 1st century. He recorded, "Perhaps most important has been the isolation in 1969 of the Iron Age tell. The limits of the Iron Age occupation, while not entirely clear, appear to be on the flat surface of the slopes immediately beneath the basilica and to the east. The work was carried out by Israel Archaeological Society. Bethlehem appears to have been a major area of occupation from the Paleolithic period." Former astrologer and author of Spellbound, The Paranormal Seduction of Today's Kids, Marcia Montenegro wrote, "You can't just make a story out of names like Virgo, Leo, Taurus, etc. And why doesn't the story begin with Aries? If it did, then Leo comes before Virgo, yet Leo is supposedly Jesus, the Lion of Judah. It seems it would come after Virgo, not before, in a story."
There's another very interesting phenomenon that occurs around December 25th, or the winter solstice. From the summer solstice to the winter solstice, the days become shorter and colder. And from the perspective of the northern hemisphere, the sun appears to move south and get smaller and more scarce. The shortening of the days and the expiration of the crops when approaching the winter solstice symbolize the process of death to the ancients. It was the death of the sun. And by December 22nd, the sun's demise was fully realized, for the sun, having moved south continually for 6 months, makes it to its lowest point in the sky. Here a curious thing occurs. The sun stops moving south, at least perceivably, for 3 days. And during this 3-day pause, the sun resides in the vicinity of the Southern Cross, or Crux, constellation. And after this time, on December 25th, the sun moves 1 degree, this time north, foreshadowing longer days, warmth, and spring.
Anybody with a simple astrology program can confirm for themselves that during the lifetime of Jesus, or in any other time for that matter, that when the sun rises, it is nowhere near the Southern Cross. The idea that the sun rises in the Southern Cross constellation is ridiculous. Dr. Noel Swerdlow is professor of astronomy and astrophysics at the University of Chicago. He also specialized in the study of the practice of astronomy in antiquity through the 17th century. He states, that crux, the Southern Cross, was not recognized as a separate constellation in antiquity because, as seen from the Mediterranean, it is low on the southern horizon and is surrounded on three sides by the stars of Centaurus, which is a large prominent constellation, and the four bright stars of crux are included as stars of Centaurus in Ptolemy's star catalog. It is only when you go farther to the south, so that the crux is higher in the southern sky, that it becomes prominent as a group of stars by itself, so its recognition had to wait until the southern voyages of the 16th century. Thus, the Southern Cross was not even discovered or recognized until the 16th century, long after the first century writers of the New Testament.
And thus it was said, the Son died on the cross, was dead for 3 days, only to be resurrected or born again.
Christians have never said anything like this, that the Son, S-U-N, died on the cross. Maybe Peter Joseph wants us to think ancient religions said this, but they did not either, and there is likewise no reference or source for such a saying.
Now, probably the most obvious of all the astrological symbolism around Jesus regards the 12 disciples. They are simply the 12 constellations of the zodiac, which Jesus, being the Son, travels about with.
The source for this claim is author and skeptic Acharya S., who alleges the Son's followers or disciples are the 12 signs of the zodiac through which the Son must pass. But Jesus did not pass through his 12 disciples in any fashion similar to the zodiac. If the Bible was based off the zodiac, we would expect to see the similar movement of Jesus through the disciples. Furthermore, the 12 disciples were most certainly assigned by Jesus because of the 12 tribes of Israel, which Zeitgeist also alleges is symbolic of the zodiac. But the book of Genesis was written approximately in 1000 BC and contains the story of the 12 tribes of Israel, which would have occurred even earlier. The division into the 12 zodiacal signs did not occur until the Babylonians made the divisions in the 5th century BC. Therefore, reading astrology into the 12 tribes upon which the apostles of Jesus were based is impossible, because the 12 tribes existed long before the division of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Astronomer J. Pasakoff confirms, the Babylonians divided the zodiac into 12 constellations in the 5th century BC. So the only evidence that remains for this claim is the number 12. If we want to accept their allegations on this, however, we also need to accept that Dunkin' Donuts is owned by an astrologer, since you get a discount when you buy a dozen donuts. Grocery stores are also owned by astrologers, since they sell you eggs by the dozen. Even our legal system must be influenced by astrology, since there are 12 jurors. Unlike fictitious myths and legends associated with astrology, we have much historical evidence that the 12 apostles were indeed real historical people. For example, in 95 AD, Clement wrote, Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors when he had at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him.
In fact, the number 12 is replete throughout the Bible.
First of all, Zeitgeist stacks this list of 12s by repetitions to make it look more impressive than it actually is. The 12 tribes of Israel, 12 sons of Jacob, and 12 great patriarchs are all the same 12. There is no difference. There are 12 judges of Israel if one was to count, but the Bible never makes any issue or significance out of it. There are actually 17 Old Testament prophets, not 12. Zeitgeist missed this figure by 5. One can only wonder where they got the idea of there being 12 kings of Israel. If referring to the northern kingdom of Israel, there were 19 kings, and there were also 19 kings in the southern kingdom plus one queen. This is not including the 3 kings of Israel before the kingdom was divided. If you add these numbers together, you do not get 12. If you subtract, multiply, or divide these numbers, you cannot get 12. And no mention or reference is made in the Bible to 12 princes. If the king's sons are in view here, then Zeitgeist is way off, for many of the 41 kings had numerous sons, like King Ahab, for example, had 70 sons.
Coming back to the cross of the zodiac, the figurative life of the sun, this was not just an artistic expression or tool to track the sun's movement. It was also a pagan spiritual symbol, the shorthand of which looked like this. This is not a symbol of Christianity. It is a pagan adaptation of the cross of the zodiac.
What Zeitgeist refers to as the cross of the zodiac is actually the wheel of the zodiac, which has no relationship to a Roman crucifixion, the way in which Jesus was killed. To extrapolate two perpendicular lines from the zodiac wheel and conclude that Romans used this as their motivation to crucify criminals is preposterous. It was not until Christianity became paganized that the cross image came to be thought of as a Christian symbol. Crosses in churches were introduced in AD 431, and the uses of crosses in steeples came about in AD 586.
Now, the Bible reflects, broadly speaking, a symbolic movement through 3 ages while foreshadowing a 4th.
The first age, they say, is Taurus the bull. In Exodus chapter 32, we read that Aaron and the Israelites made an idol of a golden calf and worshipped it, after which Moses shattered the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments after seeing the Israelites' idolatry. The Christ conspirators will suggest that the golden calf is the age of Taurus the bull. Where is the documentation for this supposed reality besides page 146 of Acharya S.'s book? The New Testament, written long after the age of Taurus the bull in Jesus' generation, also mentions calves, but this is not convenient for their argument. Second, they say Moses represents the preceding age of Aries the ram. They say that Moses represents the ram and that this is the reason Jews blow the ram's horn. However, Moses has never recorded blowing a ram's horn. Additionally, Moses cannot be identified as a ram by any interpretation within Scripture and does not fit this picture. Even Zeitgeist's own source for this claim, Leopold Wagner, says no such thing. On the page cited of Wagner's book, we read, "The use of the ram's horn at this season is appropriate, since, according to tradition, it was on this first day of Tishri that a ram was offered up instead of Isaac on Mount Moriah." Thus, even Zeitgeist's source states the obvious reality as to why Jews blow the ram's horn today and says nothing of the age of Aries. The most memorable text in the Bible mentioning a ram is that previously mentioned in Zeitgeist's own source, where God provided the sacrifice of a ram for Abraham instead of Isaac his son. However, this event was generations prior to Moses and would not fit chronologically into Zeitgeist's twisted interpretation of the Bible. The third symbolic age allegedly is the age of Pisces, the 2 fish. They claim that because Jesus fed 5,000 people with bread and 2 fish, and because Jesus befriended 2 fishermen who followed him, that this must be symbolic of the age of Pisces. Actually, 4 of Jesus' disciples were fishermen, not just 2. Though 4 disciples were fishermen, what about other followers of Jesus? Matthew, for instance, was a tax collector, Simon was a zealot, Luke was a physician and historian, Paul was a Pharisee and a tent maker. What is their significance to astrology? They have none.
And I think we have all seen the Jesus fish on the back of people's cars. Little do they know what it actually means. It is a pagan astrological symbolism for the sun's kingdom during the age of Pisces.
Actually, the fish symbol was an identifying symbol for Christ which early persecuted Christians used, and it has nothing to do with the age of Pisces. The Greek word ichthus for fish is an acrostic based on the initials of Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Indeed, Jesus fed 5,000 people with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, but he later fed 4,000 people with a few fish, or more fish than 2 fish, and 7 loaves of bread. Obviously, Zeitgeist does not quote this event because it does not fit their paradigm. According to Zeitgeist hermeneutic, it could just as easily be called the age of bread, but there is no such thing. Jesus also healed people, gave sight to the blind, raised the dead, walked on water, and cast out demons of people, but there is no astrological ages accompanying these miracles. Besides, fish and fishermen are also mentioned in the Old Testament, which predated Jesus and was prior to the age of Pisces. New Testament stories also refer to a rooster, doves, donkeys, birds, camels, sheep, and goats, yet none of these animals would normally fall under the age of Pisces like fish. In Luke chapter 22 verse 10, Jesus tells his disciples to enter into the city where they will meet a man bearing a pitcher of water. Acharya S. and Zeitgeist claim this is a symbolic foreshadowing of the age of Aquarius, or the water bearer. How the text conveys foreshadowing one cannot say except for Acharya S. Acharya goes farther than Zeitgeist, claiming Jesus was baptized in Aquarius, the water bearer, hinting that Jesus will bring in the age of Aquarius. But the age of Aquarius begins around AD 2150, so how exactly was Jesus baptized in Aquarius? Acharya S. then claims that Jesus became the Good Shepherd and the Lamb in Aries the Ram. Aries, from about 2150 BC to AD 1, which has already been attributed to Moses, is now attributed to Jesus, but has nothing to do with Jesus, just as it had nothing to do with Moses. A lamb is not a ram and has nothing to do with shepherding sheep. The only parallel here is that they are animals. This is a wild generalization. She goes on to state that Jesus told parables of the sowing and tilling in the fields in Taurus the bull. Acharya has now attributed all four of these ages to Jesus somehow. But which one is it? To these critics, any mention of bulls is automatically accredited to the age of Taurus, any mention of animals to the age of Aries, any reference to fish to the age of Pisces, and any reference of water to the age of Aquarius. You would think that there would be much less broad and cryptic references if this were the reality and the intention of the writers of the Bible. Jesus told parables and several agricultural metaphors, including fig trees, wheat and tares, sheep and goats, seeds, and many others. But there is no supposed symbolic age for these parables. Obviously, Bible stories will abound with fish, because fish were the most common source of protein near the Sea of Galilee.
Now, we have all heard about the end times and the end of the world. The cartoonish depictions in the book of Revelation aside, the main source of this idea comes from Matthew 28:20, where Jesus says, "I will be with you even to the end of the world." However, in the King James Version, world is a mistranslation, among many mistranslations. The actual word being used is eon, which means age. I will be with you even to the end of the age, which is true, as Jesus' solar Piscean personification will end when the sun enters the age of Aquarius. The entire concept of end times and the end of the world is a misinterpreted astrological allegory. Let's tell that to the approximately 100 million people in America who believe the end of the world is coming.
Peter Joseph alleges that the main source for the Christian idea of the end of the world comes from Matthew 28:20, but this passage has nothing to do with Christian views of the end of the world. Rather, a complete thematic treatment of the passages concerning the end of the world make up most Christian views, which, for the most part, agree that Jesus will return as a thief in the night in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those that don't know God, and the earth will be burned up. Indeed, the word world in the King James Bible is translated to aeon in the Greek, or age. This word means forever, an unbroken age, perpetuity of time or eternity. Jesus was not referring to any astrological age like Aquarius or Pisces. He was referring to the end of the world or the end of the times as we know it. The Greek word aeon was used again by Jesus in reference to the end of the world when he said, "The harvest is the end of the world," or aeon, and the reapers are the angels. In Luke chapter 1 verse 70, Jesus refers to God's holy prophets which have been since the world or aeon began. God's prophets, such as Moses, did not live in the astrological age of Pisces as Jesus, yet Jesus includes them in this passage. It is obvious Jesus is not referring to an astrological age here. Paul stated in Romans 12:2, "Do not be conformed to this world or aeon, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Again, he is referring to time since the world began until it ends. The Bible also says, "The world or aeon passes away, and the lust thereof, but he that does the will of God abides forever."
The amount of time it takes for the procession to go through all 12 signs is roughly 25,765 years. This is also called the Great Year, and ancient societies were very aware of this.
The narrator, Peter Joseph, makes sure to say that ancient societies were very aware of this, because Zeitgeist's whole premise and theory is dependent upon the ancients acknowledging the astronomical concept to which they refer. However, modern astrological beliefs are not identical to the ancient astrological beliefs, and Zeitgeist's argument regarding the various astrological ages is irrelevant. Historian of science and winner of the Genius Award from the MacArthur Foundation, Dr. Noel Swerdlow's response to Acharya's claims in Zeitgeist are as follows. In antiquity, constellations were just groups of stars, and there were no borders separating the regions of one from the region of another. The modern ideas about the age of Pisces or the age of Aquarius are based upon the location of the vernal equinox in the regions of the stars of those constellations. But the regions, the borders between those constellations, are a completely modern convention of the International Astronomical Union for the purpose of mapping, and never had any astrological significance. I hope this is helpful, although in truth what this woman is claiming is so wacky that it is hardly worth answering. So when this woman says that the Christian fish was a symbol of the coming age of Pisces, she is saying something that no one would have thought of in antiquity. Because in which constellation of the fixed stars the vernal equinox was located was of no significance, and is entirely an idea of modern, I believe 20th century astrology. The borders of constellations between, say, Aries, Pisces, and Aquarius are modern conventions of the International Astronomical Union, and there is nothing ancient about them.
The Bible is nothing more than an astrotheological literary hybrid, just like nearly all religious myths before it.
Most people with a basic knowledge of the Bible would immediately see the fallacies and contradictions in these arguments. For example, the Bible and Jesus are clearly not hidden allegorical prescriptions for sun and star worship, because in Genesis chapter 1, God created the sun, moon, and stars. A further distinction is in Deuteronomy chapter 4, where God specifically forbids the Israelites to worship the sun and stars as the Egyptians did. Through the prophet Isaiah, God mockingly asked if the stargazers could actually protect those who follow them from the real power and maker of the universe. In the book of the prophet Ezekiel, God showed to Ezekiel in a vision 25 men of Judah in the inner court of the temple worshiping the sun rather than God. God considered this an abomination. Additionally, in 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 5, the priests who burned incense to the sun, to the moon, and to the planets were called idolatrous priests. Not one of these scriptures are referenced in Zeitgeist because it would destroy their argument, distinguishing clearly between the celestial bodies and the creator of them. The origin of Christianity arose out of Judaism, which denounced these practices all throughout the Old Testament.
In the Old Testament, there is the story of Joseph. Joseph was a prototype for Jesus. Joseph was born of a miracle birth. Jesus was born of a miracle birth. Joseph was of 12 brothers. Jesus had 12 disciples. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver. Brother Judah suggests the sale of Joseph. Disciple Judas suggests the sale of Jesus. Joseph began his work at the age of 30. Jesus began his work at the age of 30. The parallels go on and on.
Here, Zeitgeist's case is very misleading. Though God opened Rachel's womb, it's difficult to consider the birth of Joseph a miracle birth like that of Jesus, who was divine and born of a virgin. Indeed, Jesus had 12 disciples, but Joseph only had 11 brothers. There is no parallel. Though Judas suggested the sale of Joseph, it was Midianite merchantmen that sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites as a slave. Jesus, on the other hand, was not sold, but betrayed by Judas, who was paid 30 pieces of silver by the Jews. Jesus did begin his ministry at age 30, but Joseph began his prophetic ministry receiving dreams from God at age 17. The age 30 for Joseph is mentioned in Genesis, but the Bible simply says, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Aside from Zeitgeist parallels being inaccurate, the simple fact that there are parallels between Jesus and other people in the Bible like Joseph does not make either of them fictional.